Hi, it's Nicole, and today I'm going to be doing my April and May wrap-up. The first book I finished in April was actually Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin, but I've already done a review on that I tacked on to the end of my March wrap-up because I literally finished it the first day of April. So the first book I'm going to be talking about is Anna Dahlqvist's It's Only Blood. It was translated by Alice Olsson. I thought this book was really solid, even though I found that it wasn't particularly surprising and none of the information was super new to me. But that's also partly because these things interest me generally, and so I was aware of a lot of the things that she was talking about, but it was still good to get a deeper understanding of the situation more globally, because the book does talk about lots of different countries and not just one area of the world. I also found it to be a little bit repetitive for my liking, but I think that was supposed to be a stylistic thing to drive home the point that she was trying to make, that menstruation has become a taboo topic that you can't really talk about as freely as we should be able to, and not being able to talk about it is one of the things that's creating a lot of problems, not just social, but we're seeing problems economically spring from that, and all sorts of other things that could be tackled if we were just able to deal with menstrual management in a more open and healthy way. I also appreciated that the language that she was using was very inclusive, even though she doesn't go in depth about trans issues and talking about menstruators as opposed to just women. But the focus of the book overall is women, and that's partly because it's a shorthand, and it's also because women are the biggest, most obvious target of the kind of discrimination that happens with menstruation. The next book I read in April was Everything I Know About Love by Dolly Alderton. This is going to sound a little bit harsh, but it felt a lot like simplistic life lessons from a self-destructive person who is really slow to learn from any of their repeated mistakes. That doesn't really gel well with me, but I do realize that this is a really popular book, and I think it's in part because of all of the nostalgia that a lot of British people, particularly British women, feel when they read this book, because she's had a pretty stereotypical middle-class British woman kind of life, I guess. And since coming over to the UK, I have sometimes wondered what it might be like to grow up in a school system like this, just because it's different from the one that I grew up with. And I wonder sometimes about the differences between growing up in different places and how that might affect you, or the way that you think, or the way that you see things. And I feel like, from what I've observed from being here since I was 19, I get why people like this book, and I get why they relate to it and all of that stuff, but she is not someone that I personally can identify with in any real measurable way. So I think there was just a distance because of us just being different people and my not being able to really relate to it. That doesn't mean that the book was bad or anything like that, it just really wasn't for me. If Cats Disappeared from the World by Genki Kawamura and translated by Eric Selland was the next book that I read. It was a little quirky and pretty different from what I had expected. I expected something that was going to be a little bit closer to The Guest Cat, and it wasn't that. Probably ultimately pretty forgettable, but it was not a bad reading experience by any means. It was a fun little read to pick up, and I kind of think it might be one of those books that would be really good to pick up in between some heavier reads to sort of break things up and get you out of a more intense reading feeling. The next book I read was the Ladybird book of The Hipster by Jason Hazeley, and this was cute, and it had some light jokes in it, and some parts were really funny, but I think this is probably the case with the whole series and any books that are like this. The joke kind of wears off really quickly, and then this one in particular, and I don't know if they're all like this, but this one ended really abruptly as well, so it was kind of like a little unsatisfying end, but I also don't expect too much of it because it's one of those novelty reads. Then I read The Trauma Cleaner by Sarah Krasnostein, and I'm inclined to agree with Jen Campbell's review of this book. I found that there was a lot of deifying of Sandra, which really didn't work for me, especially since for me it started to feel really ironic in light of a lot of her repeated cruelty to people around her who actually did care about her. And while I understand that as coming with the package of being a complex, flawed human being, I felt like the language alongside the story just did not handle that very well. And then outside of that, I just wasn't that satisfied with the story and didn't really know by the end of it what I was meant to get from it in a way. And I mean, I found Sandra as a person interesting, but something about the story just didn't quite work for me. I think I was a little bit more curious about the work that she actually does rather than having these sort of snapshots of the clients whose houses she was cleaning. And there would be little bits and pieces looking at her actual work, but I guess it just wasn't enough for me. I think also before even picking up this book, I had a feeling that I might be the type of person who prefers memoir over biography, and I did keep feeling like I sort of wish that she was able to tell her own story rather than it be told by someone else. And maybe that would have been much worse, but that's kind of what I was wanting after a while. And last but not least, if you've been following the low impact challenge I've been doing, you will know that I read This Changes Everything by Naomi Klein. I've done a series of videos with updates about the book as I was reading, and I think in the last video I really wrapped up most of my feelings, but 3 things that I left out that I kind of wish I had mentioned were firstly the fact that she doesn't really get much into population growth or anything like that, pretty much at all. That's something that Joe had mentioned in the comment of one of my videos. That was earlier on in the book, and I didn't know if Naomi Klein would get into that subject a bit more later, and she didn't. However, more recently I did actually watch a video that was narrated by David Attenborough. It was a really short one that just popped up on my YouTube, and he kind of indicated that although population growth is an issue for us, it's not quite what I had at least originally thought the issue was. I think the statistic that was mentioned in the video was that the number of 16-year-olds has actually not changed very much in the last 20 years, meaning that there's not really any growth at the lower end of populations. The real issue is that we're all living a lot longer, so it's a lot more older people. So it actually might not necessarily be the best approach for us to have as a global population fewer children, but it made me think that perhaps more immigration would actually be the best thing to do to help prop up older generations as they continue to live a lot longer than previously. If I can find that video, I'll leave that down below. It was only mentioned very briefly, but I think it's worth sharing anyway. The other thing that I wanted to mention was that Naomi Klein often proposes as solutions systems that would be considered socialist systems, but she is still somewhat critical of socialism as an ideology. She doesn't really get into it loads because the focus in the book is capitalism and the flaws of capitalism, especially since that's much more widespread and that has really taken over our global outlook of everything, even in countries that purport to be socialist. But what she is really suggesting is that we implement more socialist systems that are put in practice through decentralizing the power that controls those systems. So instead of, say, renationalizing public transport or energy and then centralizing that power in government, we would decentralize that power by putting that within different groups within a country, like cooperatives and neighborhoods, communities. And she talks about how this is happening somewhat in areas of Germany with their renationalization and greening of a lot of their power. There are cooperatives, for example, that have solar panels or fields owned by a group of farmers that might have wind turbines, and so the energy is being produced by loads of different people that are putting back energy into the grid, but that kind of decentralized power is a lot harder to corrupt. And lastly, I learned just how important Indigenous rights are, not just on an ethical level, but also as a last defense against climate change. And along with that, she talks quite a lot about the reciprocal relationship that we need to regain with nature rather than having this idea of dominance. And that idea of dominance comes from a capitalist ideology, and all of those things I found really enlightening, and I learned quite a lot, and I loved that book and I gave it 5 stars, so I would highly recommend it. So those are all the books that I read in April and May, and I will see you again next time. Bye!